If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell me with such high zest, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. British poet Wilfred Owen's "Dulce et decorum est" is one of the most famous war poems of the 20th century. Most of the poem describes the horrors of modern warfare, and the final lines of the excerpt, translated as "It is sweet and noble to die for one's country," he labels the old lie. No previous war had involved as many nations from different parts of the world, and none had killed as many soldiers and civilians. At the outbreak of World War I, Britain was the only major power going into the war without universal conscription, compulsory enlistment in the armed forces. Realizing that patriotism could be contagious, the British Army began to recruit PALS battalions made up of men who already knew each other. The first of these was made up of a group of stockbrokers from the city of London. Other PALS battalions were recruited in cities throughout Britain, such as Liverpool and Manchester. Because the men who volunteered were friends or associates, these battalions were especially close-knit. By the end of the war, 1 out of 4 British men had served in the military. Many Europeans saw war differently during the first few months of World War I. "Everybody said it'll be over by Christmas," one soldier recalled. The war began in June 1914. Hundreds of thousands of teenage boys enthusiastically enlisted in the military, dreaming of being a hero. Wartime assemblies sounded more like high school pep rallies, in which speakers naively predicted swift and easy victories in battles against supposedly inferior enemies. Leaders of some of the socialist parties were among the few Europeans who spoke out against the war. Even socialists were divided on the issue, however, as many supported the war efforts of their nations. At the time, few people actually understood how brutal 20th century warfare could be. As the war dragged on, the world became aware of the horrific effects of new advances in war technology and tactics, such as trench warfare, poison gas, machine guns, submarines, airplanes, and tanks. With both the Central Powers and the Allies using brutal weapons and tactics, neither side could defeat the other. The result was a bloody 4-year stalemate in which the death toll and suffering rose ever higher. The defining experience for most soldiers in this war was the time spent in the trenches. Long ditches dug in the ground, with the excavated earth banked in front, in order to defend against enemy fire. Trench warfare was not a glorious way to fight a war. Soldiers dug hundreds of miles of trenches facing one another, and they slept, ate, and fought in these trenches for months at a time. Trenches were often cold, muddy, and rat-infested. Many soldiers died from diseases caused by unhygienic conditions. One novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, and the 1930 film based on it gave a vivid sense of a soldier's life in the trenches. Remarque was a young German soldier during World War I. Poison gas was one of the most insidious weapons of the new style of warfare. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were used during World War I. Soldiers were soon equipped with gas masks, which were effective when used immediately. Although fatalities were limited, the effects of a gas attack could be extremely painful and long-lasting. Many veterans suffered permanent damage to their lungs. After the war, international treaties outlawed the use of poison gas in warfare. Developed in the late 1800s, machine guns could fire more than 500 rounds of ammunition per minute, increasing the deadly impact of warfare. The weapon made it difficult for either side in a battle to gain new territory. Although primitive submarines had been used briefly in the American Civil War, they played a much larger part in World War I, wreaking havoc on the shipping lanes of the Atlantic Ocean. Airplanes in 1914 were still light, small, and unable to carry many weapons. Therefore, they did not present much of a threat to troops, vehicles, or ships. At first, airplanes were used mainly to carry on recon or observation of enemy lines. By 1915, they were being fitted with machine guns, and aerial combat began. Individual air aces would engage in dogfights with enemy aircraft. The British developed tanks to protect troops as they moved across vast areas of difficult terrain, even over trenches, with the ability to fire at the enemy. They were developed by the Royal Navy and originally referred to as land ships. They got their name from the fact that during their development, they were disguised as water tanks. Economic ties between the United States and the Allies were one of the underlying reasons for U.S. entry into the war in 1917. In addition, many Americans believed that the Allied nations were more democratic than the Central Powers were. A third reason was growing resentment against the Germans, especially for U-boat attacks on ships carrying civilians, including Americans. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine attacked and sank the Lusitania, an ocean liner carrying more than 100 U.S. citizens among its passengers. The event that finally pushed the United States into the war was the interception of the Zimmermann telegram in January 1917. In this document, the German government offered to help Mexico reclaim territory it had lost to the United States in 1848 if Mexico allied itself with Germany in the war. Combatant nations intensified the conflict in World War I by committing all their resources to the war effort. This strategy, known as total war, meant that a nation's domestic population, in addition to its military, was committed to winning the war. Thus, millions of civilians, including women, worked in factories producing war materials. Workers imported from China helped make up for the labor shortages in Britain, France, and Russia. Entire economies were centered on winning the war. Governments set up planning boards that set production quotas, price and wage controls, and the rationing of food and other supplies. They censored the media and imprisoned many who spoke out against the war effort. Propaganda was another component of total war. Propaganda is communication meant to influence the attitudes and opinions of a community around a particular subject by spreading inaccurate or slanted information. Governments invested heavily in Army and Navy recruitment campaigns and other wartime propaganda. Posters and articles in newspapers and magazines often depicted the enemy crudely or misrepresented the facts of the war completely. For example, American and British propaganda demonized the German army, exaggerating reports of atrocities against civilians. Likewise, German propaganda demonized the Americans and the British. The use of highly emotional and often misleading information created hatred and bitterness across borders among civilians as well as soldiers. Other propaganda was more subtle. For example, the U.S. government sent artists to the front lines in Europe to illustrate scenes of battle and glorify Allied soldiers. World War I was fought in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Not since the 7 Years' War of the late 18th century had there been such a global war. Most of the major combatants in World War I ruled colonies in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. Competition for these colonies was one major reason for the war. Imperialism extended the boundaries of the war, and major battles were fought in North Africa and the Middle East. Japan entered the war on the side of the Allies so that it could take control of German colonies in the Pacific and in China. The British seized most of Germany's colonies in Africa. However, Germans held on to German East Africa, later called Tanzania. The British also defended the Suez Canal from an attack by the Ottoman Empire. Colonial troops reinforced their home country forces in several battles. About 500,000 Australians and New Zealanders enlisted to fight the war. These troops formed a special corps known as Anzac and fought in the bloody year-long campaign at Gallipoli, a peninsula in northwestern Turkey, that resulted in heavy Allied losses with little to show for the effort. Canadian troops fought in several European battles. Britain drafted Africans and Indians for combat roles in Europe. Some 90,000 Gurkha soldiers from Nepal fought in the Indian Army. Approximately 1.3 million soldiers served in the Indian Army during the war in Europe and Southwest Asia. The French army included 450,000 Africans, mostly from West Africa and Algeria, as well as another 110,000 Europeans from North Africa. Some 44,000 Indo-Chinese soldiers fought in the French army, with nearly 50,000 more working in support roles behind the lines. Some colonial troops fought in the hopes that their efforts would gain them recognition from their colonizers, who often promised the colonies self-rule after the war ended. Arabs, long under the rule of the Turkish-led Ottoman Empire, fought with the Allies because the British promised self-rule after the war if they were victorious. Arab troops attacked Ottoman forts in Arabia and present-day Israel and helped the British take over the cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Jerusalem. In the early 20th century, most countries did not allow women to vote or to be soldiers. However, the sheer numbers of men enlisting meant that women's lives changed significantly. They began replacing those men on farms and in factories. Thousands of women served on the front lines as nurses, ambulance drivers, and switchboard operators. Most countries forbade women from serving in combat, but Russia, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria allowed it. In 1917, the Russian government created an all-female battalion as propaganda to shame men into continuing to fight. Their commander led the first Russian women's battalion of death. Her name was Maria Bakkavara. The war itself greatly damaged Europe. However, the peace conference held in its wake would even have more profound effects on the entire world. The leaders of the victorious countries at the Paris Peace Conference became known as the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson from the United States, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, George Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. The Italians walked out of the peace conference in a rage because Italy would not get territories they had promised when they joined the Allies, including the city of Fiume on the Adriatic Sea. Russia was not invited because of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Big Four had different versions of how to settle the peace. President Wilson's pledge to establish peace without victory reflected his belief that no one country should be severely punished or greatly rewarded. France clearly rejected this view. Clemenceau believed that France, out of all the Allies, had suffered the most. He argued that the victorious powers should seek some sort of revenge on the Central Powers for starting the war. Clemenceau called Wilson an unrealistic idealist who was naive about European relations. Despite Clemenceau's protest, Wilson pushed for his principles, which he outlined in a document called the 14 Points. He particularly wanted to create a League of Nations, an organization in which all nations of the world would convene to discuss conflicts openly as a way to avoid the simmering tensions that had caused World War I. Although the other nations agreed to establish the League, the U.S. Senate voted against joining it and against ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, the 1919 peace treaty with Germany. Wilson also believed that conquered peoples under the defeated Central Powers deserve the right to self-determination, to decide their own political futures. Instead of the colonies and territories of the Central Powers being snatched up by the Allies, conquered peoples should have the right to decide their own political fate. A number of new nations were created or resurrected in Europe as the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were broken up. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The last three of these were home to Slavic people. Because Wilson failed to convince France and Britain not to punish Germany, the Treaty of Versailles treated Germany harshly. Most notably, Germany had to pay billions of dollars in reparations for damage caused by the war, give up all of its colonies, and restrict the size of its armed forces. Germans took the entire blame for the war. Signing the treaty was humiliating for German leaders. Moreover, the terms of the treaty caused tremendous hardship to the nation during the decade following World War I. The German economy suffered from sky-high inflation, partly due to reparations the country was forced to pay. The German people were bitter in the immediate aftermath of the Paris Peace Conference. Resentment towards the Weimar Republic, which had agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, set the stage for an extreme and militaristic political party known as the Nazis to take power barely 15 years later.